And let me be the first to say thank you so much for speaking to us, for helping make this an even better conference. We are all very, very lucky to have had you as our keynote speaker this year. And now I'm sure people will have questions in the chat that Dana, you can scan for and help read out for us. But again, thank you so much.
Thank you. That was really, I wish I could pre-record every talk now. I feel like I was so much more productive and effective. Like, oh, I can respond to things. I can, have free space in my brain. Oh, I can't hear you.
Yeah, Dana, you're muted, I think, because you're still like attending the keynote
Yeah, I was trying
mode.
Yeah. While we're waiting on questions to roll in, it was, as you were talking about cultivating these spaces and taking a look at what types of musical scenes we're participating in, it was really cool to see that enacted in the chat. The space that your words was enabling us to have with each other, and just the openness and vulnerability being modeled. That's something that I don't think we've ever seen in a keynote for any conference, let alone this one. So, thank you for your words that allowed that to happen, because I think what was just happening in that chat was really special.
That was very, very special. I always tell everyone I'm a Pisces, so I cry all the time anyways, but I was really tearing up just with all of the beautiful testimonies. And there was there were a few comments there about how unfortunately rare and weird it is for us to, with our friends outside of specific communities, share these testimonies of how we enter into music or video game music space, or how our hobbies, the things that we love, we keep them siloed in so many regards, and yet they're huge parts of who we are and how we navigate. And so we can feel fractured in so many areas of our life because we don't feel like we have the freedom to express those things. So it was really nice hearing folks say, oh yeah, I loved that song, or that song changed my entire life and introduced me to my wife. Those kinds of testimonies are really what we need right now.
Yeah. Don't be shy, chat, jump on.
Questions.
As we've pointed out earlier, sometimes when there's no questions, it's because everyone's blown away and they're trying to absorb it.
I'm taking this as a good thing.
Okay. Totally. Go ahead, Ryan.
I was going to say, when I started graduate school, which feels like an eternity ago, even though I swear I'm not that old, I remember that my experience is about coming to this through video game music, and I come to a lot of this as a longtime Overclocked Remix fan, an occasional performer for them. I see that Drum Ultima and Arrow are in the chat, also from Overclocked Remix. And that whole experience, politely I'll say, was unwelcome. When I started graduate school, I kind of had to fight for validity in some ways when I started. And by the time I graduated, partly because I was then doing cool things, thanks to a bunch of other leaders who have come before me, who are also in the chat room right now. Once you get published, once you're presenting on stuff, you have kind of a foot to stand on. But as a new graduate student, they were like, that can't be your specialty. What are you talking about?
Right. This isn't real. It's interesting that you say that, because one of my favorite authors is, I'm sorry to cut you off. You were still talking.
No, sorry.
And I just got so excited.
At my chat at the other computer.
I'm going to copy some. I'm going to copy in some questions.
My face turning is not me not paying attention to you. I'm on four monitors here in this broadcast battle station.
The full command station. Yeah, but what you were saying actually reminds me a lot of conversations that were had in the early history of hip hop, pop culturally and in academic spaces. So I think a lot about Trisha Rose, who's written this phenomenal book, Black Noise, and a lot of people reference this as being the book that gave them a sort of broader consciousness of what this art form was, what's possible within this art form. But when she was working on her dissertation and talking to her committees, they were saying, this is a fad. Hip hop is a fad. It's going to be gone. Why are you investing all of your time and energy into this thing? You need to ground yourself in some, all those discussions, conversations about it not really being music, et cetera, et cetera. So it strikes me as a kind of similar fight in trying to carve out space for yourself for something that you know is important because there's community there and it gives you actual joy. But it's often those things aren't legible in academic spaces, which is so frustrating. And then after the fact, it's like, oh, that actually is incredible. And we should have given some time and thought to that. But it takes certain metrics in order for them to be rendered legible. So I share your frustration.
All right, now we have some questions. It was interesting. A lot of the questions that came in were kind of the same question, but just phrased in very different ways. So essentially, the thread running through all of these is sort of, there's a lot of momentum happening in the present moment, and how do we capitalize on this in our music curricula, in our own research? How do we let it not just be a hashtag moment? And create just lasting change and be the change we want to see in these spaces.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are a few different possibilities. The first is like radical redistribution. And when I'm talking about academic spaces, I mean investing programming and taking the money, the budgets that we have to bring artists in and to create space, to really focus on those artists who are never represented in those spaces, and really doing the work. And that takes a certain level of investment. That means knowing a community well enough to know who can speak to that and who kind of deserves to be supported in that way, in that capacity. And so I think it's, on the one hand, just kind of redistributing kind of university resources and other things that we have access to in our positions as academics, but then also deeply connecting with communities of where music is being practiced, as an observer, as a guest, as someone who has a position of power potentially and can use that, leverage that for good. So that's something I've been thinking a lot about as I've entered into this new position at Brown, is like, who are my friends? Who can I get into this space in a classroom? Because I think, like Ryan was saying, outside of having like the piece of paper or the cosign from this director or that professor, it can be really hard to enter into a space, even if you are an expert in what you do, right? And so having our cosign, having us say, no, I know that this person is the expert, is all that it takes, I think, to kind of transfer some of that power over. I also think, having candid conversations about the histories of music spaces, the histories of musicology or departments, and not shying away from that in our conversations with students. I think to not engage with the reality of what music departments look like or certain music composition spaces look like is doing a disservice to the students who are, they are sentient humans, they can see this. But then it also invites their solutions, their ideas about what it would mean to kind of radically reformat the space. So being open to conversation, I think, and being really, really honest. Like, now is the moment for like critical honesty.
Yeah, and I think one thing to note is how many people just got PhDs in this space, and how many of us are starting to get those first jobs. And, think about, okay, I've been this like powerless grad, we talked about being powerless and vulnerable, and then going, okay, now I can start yelling at my university to bring people in.
Yeah, right.
We have another wonderful question about the phrase, if my musicality had been rendered legible, and what sorts of things would have made your music feel legible, and how can we make others' music legible as they're starting out?
I think that's a really, really great question. So there are a few different parts of that. I think at that time, legibility to me partially meant that I was making computer music. And I hadn't sort of seen that as a practice in a formal kind of music department space. Like, I didn't know what computer music meant to other people. For me, it was like, this is the space where I make the things in my head because I don't know how to translate it to any other thing. And I think that's definitely starting to shift in a lot of formal, academic music spaces, but also elsewhere. I think that there are fewer conversations about who is and isn't like talented, based on the tools that they use, as when I was kind of first entering into this universe. So I think part of the legibility question is being resolved by having, courses and other things that are taught using the tools that students are using to make music. Like, okay, well, let's talk about Ableton. Let's talk about Reason. Let's let's talk about GarageBand, right? Let's like demystify these tools that allow people access. But I think, I guess another part of it is like the histories and artists that we study and talk about. I mean, so I'm a professor of hip hop studies, and it's been shocking to me that even within my own lifetime, there has been this divorce on the part of like kids who were born, the kids that I'm teaching. So they were born in like 2001, 2002. They're shocked by the assertion that hip hop is like a Black form of art. Like that to them, they take that as like, I don't understand. Everybody does hip hop, right? Hip hop is pop music. And so there's this total detachment from like the history of where this art form comes from, and that it's the trajectory is reflective of other Black art spaces and movements. And I think that reintegrating that history into the practice of making music is really, really important. Like, I think just being honest and open about that is a critical thing. Like having students recognize that dance music and techno, right, they have roots in Chicago house, they have roots in disco, and all of these sort of Black and brown forms of music, but then there's a divorce that takes place. So like always revisiting that history, shouting it out, tweeting it out, talking about it, sharing it, keeps these spaces, I think, alive and accountable.
Love that. That was a great question from Isaac. And an earlier one that I jumped over but want to come back to from Liam that I thought was really fascinating about the advice I sometimes hear to don't study what you really love because you don't have enough scholarly distance. Do you think that advice has contributed to race, gender, and other inequality issues in academia?
Abso-freaking-lutely. Absolutely. I mean, it's like, it's frustrating, I think, on the part of like, this is what I know and what I care about, and what this professor knows and cares about aligns neatly with, like, again, what's legible to the academy. So they don't have to see it in terms of what they like, their passion project or their little pet thing. It's just sort of seen as the standard. So it's really frustrating because we all, in some regard, are engaging with what we care about and love. It's just that what somebody loves is something that is that makes sense to other academics in that space, or it doesn't. Like, those are the kind of ways that it's broken down. But I also think that that's a terrible stance because it eliminates a whole set of practices and methods that create really rich scholarship. Like autoethnography, I think, is a really powerful method of extracting a bigger story about a community or a group. Like, as I was saying during my talk, telling my story, it's like, it's my story, right? It's the personal things that have happened to me, but in that context, we're making all of these radical connections where we're talking about kind of bigger historical things. We're talking about personal moments. Like it offers this entry point for tons of other people who might not have found themselves in this space otherwise. So it's really frustrating to hear that. And I've heard that myself, that like, you can't, and the last thing I'll say is that it reinforces this idea of objectivity that is, I think, really harmful to a lot of our discourse, that you can assume a position of distance that allows you to speak objectively on something. I mean, that's an impossibility. So we may as well sort of engage with it meaningfully and talk about where we're coming from, what our investments are in it, and why it's meaningful. I think it ultimately leads to better scholarship.
Mm-hmm.
Really quickly, that last point, like, I've never heard, oh, you don't have enough distance from this, from somebody who didn't love Beethoven. Like,
exactly. Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
Man.
Total double standard.
And a great chat happening again. Just in this is creating such an interesting discursive space. There's a question about kind of related to all of that about the portfolios for a music composition master's degree, and probably for a lot of DMAs in composition as well, where there's prioritizing of real acoustic instrumental composition over computer music, and that those are kind of seen as very separate domains instead of being integrated. And the question was basically, how do you feel about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very complicated, and I'm kind of learning about these politics right now as I'm entering into. So I prior to the music department, being in a music department, I was in a science and technology studies department. So all of the kind of politics of these spaces are a little bit new to me. And so it's interesting because within my department, there's a kind of multimedia composition track. And, there's musicologists and ethnomusicologists, and within multimedia composition, there's so many different kinds of practices that folks are drawing on. So it's almost hard to build a curriculum around that. I think this question kind of highlights the constraints of our educational models, because in part, I think prioritizing this or prioritizing that is about creating like an efficient curriculum, one that makes sense and can guide someone from point A to point B, whatever point B is. And so, in my ideal world, people who really know how to make some great shit on GarageBand should be able to have access to the same space. But that also requires the people making the decisions to have an understanding of the complexity of the tools, of the ways that songs can be constructed in that. So there's all of, I think, as you were pointing out, we're part of this new wave, right, of PhDs and junior faculty and folks who have a deeper understanding of these tools and are therefore positioned to kind of better understand how people are using them and to appreciate like the kind of vast complexity of those tools. So I'm not really doing a good job of answering your question. I guess I'll just leave it at that. I recognize the constraints of trying to put together like a coherent academic program that has some kind of guidelines or structure, and like this is what it means to be in X program. But I think it's really limiting, and right now is the moment where we get to kind of blow everything up. So I do think it's worth asking, what kind of requirements, what should a portfolio look and sound like? And is that even the most effective way to evaluate, a person's kind of musical prowess?
Yeah, brilliant. And Thomas E., who just finished a DMA in composition, noted that it's not even necessarily acoustic versus computer music, but that there's this sort of genre separation and, gatekeeping of what's considered, academically important music versus working with hip hop, for example, in a composition degree.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that it's also can be tough because especially when I think about something like hip hop, right? It's at its core, it's about sort of resisting structure. And so it's like, okay, well, we're going to develop let's say we're going to develop a hip hop composition course. The sort of central tenet is like, do this thing, but also don't do this thing and resist it. Right? But if you want to get an A, kind of do this thing. There's all of these like tensions that are built into trying to bring this unwieldy musical form into a space that requires like legibility in a certain regard. So I could definitely think that it's tough and maps out differently along different genres.
It feels a little bit like the way that jazz entered the conservatory as well, and how that diverged from practice in a lot of ways. That there's this sort of ossification that happened as it became, put down in textbooks, and a lot of folks will say it's very different to go through a jazz studies program than to just go play jazz.
Yes, absolutely. And I love that you brought that point up, because I think it goes back to the power of the communities that we're building and that people have talked about, that exist independent of institutions or institutional spaces, because that, like, I'm able to be in the academy because I kind of worked through my voice and built a community and was able to be part of a scene that had nothing to do with that. I don't know. If I had kind of pursued, if I said I just want to work on this degree in science and technology studies, I don't know what my life would be like right now. So I think it's really important to keep cultivating those communities that are invested in completely different things, because you just learn your craft differently.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a lot of keeping things separate. I was just about to type in chat that, you know, I was a violinist, and so I was always kind of kept out of jazz, you know, because I was the conservatory trained. So when I asked to join the jazz band at one point, thinking of like Jean-Luc Ponty, I remember the director.
Oh yes, I love him.
Yeah, I was like, oh, I could do that. And then the director went, well, what would I do with you? And I'm like, give me treble clef. I don't know.
Yeah.
But I wasn't allowed. I wasn't allowed to enter those spaces. So it's like there's all these barriers, even in academia, that you'd think we would just be taking courses and everything, but we're still in our own lane so much.
Yeah, there's really a struggle with having people recognize what an educational space should be about.
Mm-hmm.
All of this conversation, both here in Skype and on the chat, makes me feel very lucky that I am in the game development program and not the music program at MSU. Because I never find myself having to justify game audio in the games program, except maybe in terms of budget percentage. We always want more. But the idea that the topic is not relevant is something I am very thankful to be walking right out of.
Yes.
But I think that is slowly starting to get better in the Academy, thanks in part to the efforts of this body, frankly, that everybody here continues to do really good work.
And it's just such a supportive community, I've found. You know, there is, it's scary to tap into at first when you're a newbie, but I feel like there's lasting connections to be made. And ultimately, that's what's going to drive a lot of the change.
Yeah, I have, like I said, I've wept a few times, kind of not just in this, in the keynote, but in some of the other conversations, just seeing the support and kind of generosity and genuine investment and curiosity about what people are studying. I think it's really special. Like this is not the community that I had when I was in grad school. And I very much wish that I had kind of known. I often tell people that I took a class with Roger Mosley my first year of grad school about kind of play and improvisation within music and video games. And I credit that with being the class that made me stay at Cornell, because that first year was so difficult. And the fact that I could be in a class and have conversations about this, it was like, okay, I have found a place that I can be here. So it's life-saving. It really is life-saving to have the community.
All right, can we do one more question? And then I think we're already 10 minutes over, with apologies to everybody. And so we're going to take one more and then break, I think, until the concert this evening, which I hope all of you will stick around for. I have had the distinct advantage of previewing that material by and large, and make sure you're here is what I'm going to say.
Yeah, it sounds almost like, you know, there's something in academia about go find the space yourself where you're going to be accepted. And I think a lot of what this has brought up today is how can we make those spaces not only accessible, but in people's faces where they can't help but be exposed to it. And be able to enter it and find community.
Absolutely.
This is me filling time looking for another one last question. Well, this is so cathartic. Thank you. That says Matthew Thompson. I love that.
Oh, thank you. This has been wonderful.
Yeah, seeing no more questions in the chat, I think I can speak on behalf of everybody and say thank you so much for coming and speaking with us and sharing your time throughout the day with us. We especially appreciate your engagement with the other papers and panelists throughout the day. You have been fantastic, and we are extremely lucky and honored to have had you as our keynote speaker this year.
Thank you. Thank you for all your work on organizing this. I know it has not been easy, and it's definitely a labor of love and is so needed right now. So I appreciate all of you for all of your work, and I'm looking forward to tonight and tomorrow.
All right, everybody, please clap along with my awesome sound effect box for Sammus.
Bye.